Imagine turning on your computer in 2026 and genuinely pausing for a second before choosing an operating system. Not because Linux is a quirky experiment anymore, but because it's now a serious, mainstream alternative that might finally be ready to challenge Windows on its own turf. For decades, the idea of Linux beating Windows on the desktop has lived somewhere between hopeful optimism and running joke, depending on who you asked. Windows has ruled the desktop world for over 30 years, becoming the default choice for offices, gamers, students, governments, and families alike. Linux, on the other hand, has quietly dominated servers, supercomputers, cloud infrastructure, and developer machines, while repeatedly stumbling on the desktop. But 2026 feels different, and the reasons why are more complex, more interesting, and more nuanced than a simple yes or no answer. To understand whether Linux can finally beat Windows in 2026, we need to talk about what beating even means. If beating Windows means Linux suddenly grabbing 50% of the desktop market, then the answer is almost certainly no. Windows still benefits from massive pre-installation deals with OEMs, deep integration with enterprise workflows, and decades of user familiarity. But if beating Windows means breaking its monopoly mindset, becoming a default choice people seriously consider, and winning in specific but huge categories like developers, privacy-focused users, governments, education, and even casual home users, then Linux in 2026 is closer than it has ever been. The Linux desktop experience itself has matured dramatically. Modern Linux distributions like Ubuntu, Linux Mint, Fedora Workstation, Pop!_OS, openSUSE Tumbleweed, and EndeavourOS are no longer niche tools that require constant terminal commands just to function. Ubuntu in 2026 remains the most recognized Linux distribution for desktop users, and it continues to focus on ease of use, hardware compatibility, and long-term support. Ubuntu's installer is polished, driver handling is mostly automatic, and the overall experience is smooth enough that many users can install it without ever opening a terminal. Linux Mint, especially Linux Mint Cinnamon, has become the go-to recommendation for users switching from Windows because its layout, workflow, and philosophy feel familiar while remaining fast and stable. Fedora Workstation pushes newer technologies like Wayland, Pipewire, and cutting-edge kernels, making Fedora Workstation a favorite among developers and power users who want modern Linux without sacrificing stability. Pop!_OS, backed by System76, has carved out a strong identity around productivity, tiling workflows, and out-of-the-box NVIDIA support, something that used to be a pain point for Linux users. openSUSE Tumbleweed offers a rolling release model with enterprise-grade testing, while EndeavourOS gives users an Arch Linux-based experience with far less friction than traditional Arch Linux. These Linux distributions are not just usable. They are genuinely pleasant to use in 2026. Desktop environments like GNOME, KDE Plasma, Cinnamon, and Cosmic have reached a level of polish that rivals, and in some areas exceeds, Windows. KDE Plasma, in particular, has become incredibly lightweight, customizable, and visually refined, running smoothly even on older hardware while offering deep personalization options. GNOME continues to focus on simplicity and distraction-free workflows, which appeals to users who want their system to get out of the way. This variety is one of Linux's greatest strengths, and also one of its biggest challenges because choice can confuse newcomers. But in 2026, Linux distributions are doing a much better job of guiding users toward sensible defaults. One of the biggest historical reasons Linux struggled on the desktop was software availability, and this is where the landscape has dramatically shifted. In the past, Windows dominated because all the important software was made for Windows first. In 2026, the definition of important software has changed. Web applications have replaced a massive chunk of traditional desktop software. Tools like Google Docs, Microsoft 365 Online, Slack, Discord, Figma, Notion, and countless others run perfectly in a browser, regardless of the operating system. This alone has reduced Windows' advantage significantly. On top of that, Linux native applications have improved. LibreOffice remains a strong alternative to Microsoft Office for many users. GIMP and Krita continue to grow as powerful tools for image editing and digital art. Kdenlive and DaVinci Resolve, which has an official Linux version, are now viable options for video editing. Blender, which runs exceptionally well on Linux, is a huge win for creatives. For developers, Linux has always been home, and in 2026 that advantage is even stronger, with Docker, Kubernetes, Python, Rust, Node.js, and countless developer tools working best on Linux. Gaming, once Linux's weakest point, has become one of its biggest success stories. Valve's investment in Linux through Steam, Proton, and SteamOS has completely changed the narrative. In 2026, a massive percentage of Windows games run on Linux with little to no effort thanks to Proton. Popular Linux distributions like Ubuntu, Linux Mint, and Pop!_OS make installing Steam trivial, and gaming-focused distributions like Nobara Linux, which is based on Fedora, offer performance tweaks and codecs out of the box. The Steam Deck has also played a crucial role in normalizing Linux gaming, proving to millions of users that Linux can be a capable gaming platform without them even realizing it. While anti-cheat issues still exist for a handful of games, the gap between Windows gaming and Linux gaming has never been smaller. Another critical factor in 2026 is privacy and control. Windows has increasingly leaned into cloud integration, telemetry, account requirements, and AI-driven features that many users did not ask for. Windows 11 already pushed the boundaries by requiring Microsoft accounts for many setups, integrating ads into the interface, and collecting extensive usage data. By 2026, these trends have only intensified. For some users, this is a non-issue, but for others, it's a breaking point. Linux distributions like Ubuntu, Linux Mint, Fedora Workstation, and openSUSE offer a fundamentally different philosophy. Users own their systems. There are no forced accounts, no mandatory telemetry, and no ads baked into the operating system. This has made Linux especially attractive to privacy-conscious users. Journalists, activists, developers, and everyday people who are simply tired of feeling like their computer is watching them. Governments and public institutions are another area where Linux has quietly been winning. Several countries and cities have adopted Linux-based systems for cost savings, security, and independence from proprietary vendors. In 2026, this trend continues with Linux distributions like Ubuntu LTS, Debian, and custom government Linux variants being deployed in schools, offices, and public infrastructure. These deployments may not show up in consumer market share statistics in a dramatic way, but they matter because they normalize Linux for millions of users who grow up or work with it daily. Hardware support, once a major pain point, has improved significantly. Thanks to better kernel development, increased vendor cooperation, and initiatives like Linux Vendor Firmware Service, most modern hardware works out of the box on Linux in 2026. Intel and AMD CPUs and GPUs work exceptionally well, often better than on Windows in terms of stability. AMD in particular has embraced open-source drivers, making AMD GPUs a fantastic choice for Linux users. NVIDIA, while still more complex, has improved its Linux support substantially, and distributions like Pop!_OS make NVIDIA setups far easier than they used to be. Laptops from companies like Dell, Lenovo, and System76 now ship with Linux pre-installed or officially supported, further reducing friction for new users. Despite all this progress, Linux still faces real obstacles. The biggest one is inertia. Windows is familiar. People know it, workplaces depend on it, and training materials assume it. Many specialized applications, especially in fields like engineering, accounting, and certain creative industries, still require Windows. While tools like Wine and virtual machines help, they are not perfect solutions for everyone. Linux also suffers from fragmentation, which, while a strength for enthusiasts, can confuse newcomers. The sheer number of Linux distributions, desktop environments, and package formats can overwhelm users who just want their computer to work. Another challenge is perception. For many people, Linux is still seen as that hacker thing or something for programmers. Even though distributions like Linux Mint and Ubuntu are incredibly user-friendly, this outdated image persists. Changing perception takes time, marketing, and real-world exposure. Valve accidentally did more for Linux's image with the Steam Deck than years of advocacy ever could, simply by showing Linux as a consumer-friendly product. So can Linux finally beat Windows in 2026? The honest truth is that Linux is not replacing Windows overnight, and it doesn't need to. Linux is winning in a quieter, more sustainable way. It's winning developers, gamers, privacy-focused users, students, governments, and people frustrated with the direction Windows is heading. Linux distributions like Ubuntu, Linux Mint, Fedora Workstation, Pop! _OS, and openSUSE are no longer alternatives you settle for. They are choices you actively prefer once you try them. The desktop OS war in 2026 is no longer about total domination. It's about relevance, freedom, and choice. Windows is still powerful, still dominant, and still essential for many users. But Linux is no longer stuck in Windows' shadow. It stands on its own, offering a different vision of what personal computing can be. And for the first time ever, asking whether Linux can beat Windows doesn't sound like a joke. It sounds like a real question, with a real debate, and a future that's far more open than anyone expected.